She stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move forward or retreat. For months she'd perfected the art of deflection, turning away from the one gesture that terrified her most, a simple embrace. Not because she didn't crave it, but because accepting comfort meant admitting she was broken. And mothers aren't supposed to break, are they? This is the story of a woman who carried the weight of an entire family on shoulders that had long since given out, who smiled through shattered exhaustion, and who discovered that the vulnerability she feared most was the only path to survival. What happens when the facade finally cracks? When the shame becomes heavier than the burden itself? The coffee had gone cold 3 hours ago, but Claire hadn't noticed. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of unpaid bills, the school permission slips she'd forgotten to sign, and the half-eaten sandwich her youngest had left behind. The house was finally quiet, but the silence didn't bring peace. It brought a deafening awareness of everything she was failing at. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the mug, then pulled back. Even that small act felt like too much effort. She'd been running on fumes for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to actually rest, to breathe without the crushing weight of inadequacy pressing down on her chest. It started so gradually that she didn't see it coming. First, it was the exhaustion that coffee couldn't fix. Then came the irritability that made her snap at her children over things that didn't matter. The youngest had asked for help with homework, and she'd responded with an edge in her voice that made him flinch. She saw the hoot in his eyes and hated herself for it, but the apology caught in her throat, tangled up with all the other words she couldn't say. "I'm sorry. I'm drowning. I don't know how to do this anymore." Instead, she just turned away and pretended to be busy with the dishes, scrubbing the same plate over and over until her knuckles turned white. Her husband, Tom, had tried to help last week. He'd come home early, taken one look at her face, and suggested she take a break. Go for a walk, call a friend, do something for yourself. The words were meant to be kind, but they landed like accusations, as if she had time for walks, as if she had friends she could call without feeling like a burden, as if doing something for herself wasn't the most selfish, impossible thing he could suggest. She'd smiled, that tight, brittle smile she'd perfected, and told him she was fine, just tired. The lie tasted familiar on her tongue. She'd been telling it so long that she almost believed it herself. The truth was more complicated. Claire had spent years building an identity around being capable. She was the mom who handled everything. The one who never complained, never faltered, never asked for help. Her own mother had been that way, martyring herself for her family with a quiet dignity that Claire had admired growing up. But now, living that same script, she understood what her mother had never said out loud. The dignity was just a mask for desperation. The strength was just exhaustion wearing a different name. And the silence was loneliness so profound it had carved out a hollow space inside her chest, where her sense of self used to be. The shame arrived in small moments that accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, until it became the foundation of everything she felt. There was shame in the frozen dinners she served 3 nights a week, because she couldn't summon the energy to cook. Shame in the way her daughter's teacher had gently suggested that maybe Claire should check in more often about the missed assignments. Shame in the pile of laundry that never seemed to shrink, the toys scattered across the living room floor, the dust gathering on surfaces she used to keep pristine. Each small failure whispered the same message: "You're not enough. You're failing, Mem. Any other mother could do this better." She started avoiding eye contact with other mothers at school pickup. Their put-together appearances felt like indictments of her own dishevelment. She'd see them chatting easily, making playdates and volunteering for classroom activities, and feel a surge of something she couldn't quite name. Not jealousy exactly, more like bewilderment. How were they doing it? What secret did they know that she didn't? Or maybe they were just better at pretending. Maybe their smiles were as hollow as hers, their homes as chaotic, their hearts as heavy. But she couldn't ask, couldn't reach out, because admitting she was struggling felt like admitting she was weak. And weakness wasn't allowed. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon, unremarkable in every way except for what it revealed. Claire had been sitting in her car outside the pediatrician's office, trying to pull herself together before going inside for her son's appointment. She'd been late, again, and the guilt was a familiar companion. Through the windshield, she watched other families come and go, a mother holding her toddler's hand, patient and smiling. A father carrying his daughter on his shoulders, both of them laughing. Normal scenes that felt impossibly distant from her own reality. And then she saw her, an older woman, maybe in her 60s, sitting on a bench near the entrance. She was crying quietly, not bothering to hide her tears, just letting them fall. Claire froze. There was something devastatingly honest about that moment. The woman wasn't trying to hold it together or put on a brave face. She was just being exactly what she was, broken and human and real. Claire felt something crack inside her, a fissure in the armor she'd been wearing for so long. She got out of the car and walked toward the entrance, unable to look away. The woman noticed her staring, and their eyes met. There was no judgment in that gaze, only recognition. As if this stranger could see straight through all of Claire's carefully constructed defenses to the raw truth underneath. I'm drowning too. Claire made it through the appointment on autopilot, answering the doctor's questions in monotone while her son fidgeted beside her. Everything looked fine, developmentally. He was healthy, growing, hitting his milestones. The doctor smiled and made a note in his chart, and Claire nodded along, pretending that fine meant anything at all. But as they were leaving, the nurse touched her arm gently. Are you okay? The question was so simple, so direct, that Claire felt her throat close up. She managed another one of those brittle smiles and said yes, of course, just a busy week. The nurse looked unconvinced but didn't push, and Claire hurried out before the tears could start. That night, Tom found her sitting in the dark living room long after the kids had gone to bed. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside her on the couch. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things they'd both been avoiding. Finally, he reached for her hand. Claire's first instinct was to pull away, to retreat into the familiar safety of distance. But something stopped her. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the memory of that woman on the bench, unashamed of her tears. Maybe it was just the realization that she couldn't keep pretending anymore. She let him hold her hand, and the simple warmth of that contact broke something open inside her. Tom spoke quietly into the darkness. I know you're not okay. I've known for a while. I just didn't know how to help without making it worse. The words landed softly, without accusation or demand. Claire felt the tears start, hot and relentless, and for the first time in months, she didn't try to stop them. I don't know how to do this anymore. The admission came out in a whisper, raw and frightened. I feel like I'm failing at everything, like I'm not enough for any of you, like I'm disappearing and no one even notices. The words tumbled out in a rush, all the fears she'd been carrying alone, suddenly given voice. Tom tightened his grip on her hand. You're not failing. You're exhausted. There's a difference. But Claire shook her head. The shame was still there, coiled tight in her chest. If she was just tired, she could push through. That's what mothers did. They pushed through because their families needed them. But this was something deeper. Something that rest alone wouldn't fix. She'd lost herself somewhere along the way, become nothing more than a collection of tasks and responsibilities. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt like a person instead of just a function. And the worst part was that she didn't know if anyone would care if she just stopped showing up. The next morning came too early, as it always did. Claire woke to the sound of her alarm with that familiar dread settling in her stomach. But something was different. Tom's words from the night before lingered in her mind like an echo. "You're not failing. You're exhausted." She wanted to believe him, but belief required energy she didn't have. She dragged herself out of bed and went through the motions, making breakfast, packing lunches, reminding the kids about their after-school activities. The routine was so ingrained that her body performed it automatically, while her mind drifted somewhere far away. At school drop-off, Claire sat in her car longer than usual, watching the morning rush of parents and children. She spotted the other mothers she usually avoided, the ones who seemed to have it all figured out. But today, she looked more carefully. She noticed the forced brightness in one woman's smile as she hurried her crying toddler along. The exhaustion in another mother's eyes as she checked her phone repeatedly, clearly stressed about something. The way a third woman's hands shook slightly as she handed her son his forgotten lunchbox. They were all wearing masks, just like hers, all pretending, all struggling in their own private ways. The realization didn't make her feel better exactly, but it made her feel less alone. She wasn't uniquely broken. She was human, caught in a system that demanded perfection while offering no support. Society told mothers to sacrifice everything, then shamed them when they showed signs of strain. Be present, but not overbearing. Work, but prioritize your children. Take care of yourself, but never be selfish. The contradictions were impossible to reconcile, and yet every mother she knew was trying desperately to balance on that knife's edge. Claire had been bleeding from the effort for years without realizing it. That afternoon, Claire did something she hadn't done in months. She called her sister Rachel. They'd grown distant over the past year, not from any particular conflict, but from Claire's gradual withdrawal from everyone who cared about her. Rachel answered on the second ring, surprise evident in her voice. "Hey, stranger, I was starting to think you've forgotten my number." The lightness in her tone couldn't quite mask the underlying concern. Claire took a breath, and instead of deflecting with some excuse about being busy, she told the truth. "I think I need help. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I can't keep going like this." The silence that followed felt eternal. Claire's heart pounded, shame flooding through her at the admission. But then Rachel spoke, her voice soft and steady. "There's nothing wrong with you. You're burned out. I've been worried about you for a long time, but I didn't know how to bring it up without making you defensive." The validation hit Claire like a wave. Someone saw her. Someone understood. She started crying, really crying, not the silent tears she'd learned to shed in private, but deep, shaking sobs that came from a place she'd been trying to ignore. Rachel stayed on the line, not rushing to fill the silence with platitudes or solutions, just being present while Claire fell apart. Rachel suggested they meet for coffee the next day, just the two of them, no kids, no obligations. Claire's immediate reaction was to say she couldn't, that she had too much to do. But Rachel cut her off gently. "That's exactly why you need to. Whatever you think can't wait, it can wait. Tom can handle the kids for an hour. The world won't end if you take time for yourself." Claire wanted to argue, to list all the reasons why that was impossible. But she was so tired of arguing, so tired of performing, so tired of everything. She agreed, and when she hung up, she felt the smallest flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Not hope exactly, maybe just the possibility of hope. The coffee shop the next day was warm and crowded, filled with the low hum of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine. Rachel was already there when Claire arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 steaming cups in front of her. She stood when she saw Claire and pulled her into a hug without hesitation. Claire's body went rigid at first, every instinct screaming at her to pull away. She wasn't used to physical affection anymore, hadn't realized she'd been avoiding it until this moment. But Rachel held on, steady and patient, and slowly Claire felt herself relax into the embrace. Something in her chest loosened, a knock she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. They sat down, and Rachel didn't waste time with small talk. "Tell me what's been going on, really going on," so Claire did. She talked about the exhaustion that never lifted, the irritability that made her feel like a stranger to herself, the way she'd lost interest in everything she used to enjoy, the guilt that consumed her whenever she thought about her own needs, the fear that she was damaging her children, that they'd grow up remembering her as angry and distant. The words poured out in a messy, disjointed stream, and Rachel listened without interrupting, her expression growing more concerned with each revelation. When Claire finally ran out of words, Rachel reached across the table and took her hand. "What you're describing sounds like burnout, maybe even depression. This isn't something you can just push through with willpower. You need actual help, professional help." Claire's immediate reaction was resistance. She wasn't depressed. Depressed people couldn't get out of bed, couldn't function. She was still doing everything that needed to be done. But Rachel squeezed her hand. "That's not how it works. You can be functional and still be drowning. Just because you're keeping everyone else afloat doesn't mean you're okay." The truth of that statement settled over Claire like a weight. Rachel helped her find a therapist that afternoon, making calls while they sat in the coffee shop. Because she knew if they waited, Claire would talk herself out of it. Within a week, Claire was sitting in a small, quiet office across from a woman named Dr. Martinez, who specialized in maternal mental health. The first session was harder than Claire expected. She'd imagined she'd just explain her situation, and the therapist would give her some strategies to cope better. Instead, Dr. Martinez asked questions that made Claire uncomfortable. When did you last do something just because you wanted to? When did you last feel like yourself? What would happen if you asked for what you need? Claire didn't have good answers. She realized she'd spent so long meeting everyone else's needs that she'd forgotten how to identify her own. She didn't know what she wanted anymore, didn't know who she was outside of being a mother and a wife. The person she'd been before kids felt like a ghost, someone who'd existed in another lifetime. Dr. Martinez nodded, unsurprised. "That's common. We tell women that motherhood is their identity, and then we're shocked when they lose themselves in it. But you're not just a role. You're a person, and people need care, rest, connection. Things you've been denying yourself for years." Over the following weeks, Claire started making small changes. She asked Tom to take over bedtime 2 nights a week so she could have an hour to herself. She stopped apologizing every time she set a boundary. She let the house stay messy sometimes because cleaning it required energy she didn't have. Each small act of self-preservation felt selfish at first, triggering waves of guilt that Dr. Martinez helped her work through. "You're not being selfish. You're being human. There's a difference." Slowly, painfully, Claire began to internalize that truth. She wasn't failing by needing help. She was failing by refusing to accept it. That night, after the kids were asleep, Claire stood in the bathroom looking at her reflection. She looked tired still, probably would for a while. But there was something different in her eyes, a small spark of recognition. She was starting to see herself again, the person underneath all the roles and responsibilities. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. She wasn't suddenly cured or perfectly happy, but she was healing, slowly, in the small moments between crisis and collapse. She thought about that woman on the bench outside the pediatrician's office, crying without shame. That woman had given Claire permission to be broken. And in accepting that brokenness, Claire had found the first thread of her way back. She walked into the living room where Tom was reading. He looked up and smiled, and this time she smiled back without forcing it. "Thank you for seeing me, for not letting me disappear." Tom stood and pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Claire let herself be held. She let herself be vulnerable, be imperfect, be human. The embrace she'd been avoiding out of shame became exactly what she needed. Not a solution or a cure, but a starting point. A reminder that she wasn't alone, that asking for help wasn't weakness, and that healing didn't require perfection. It just required the courage to be honest about the pain.